All right, part 3, the final installation of the Unit 5 instructor videos. Okay, let me talk a little bit about women's ordination. This is actually a pretty difficult topic to summarize, okay? For the most part, the literature is broken up into denomination, and so the justification for ordination varies from group to group. Chronologically, you have some groups ordaining, women over 100 years before other groups. And remember, it's only in some Protestant denominations that women are ordained, okay, which is actually a global minority of women, okay? So now, when you think about this process, typically churches don't go from women having no rights to full ordination, okay? Often there's like a process of sorts where women gradually gain more laity rights, okay? And then moving towards ordination from that point. Questions like, can women be voting members of a congregation? Can women have other jobs and roles within the church? Can women be church representatives at denomination-wide meetings? Can women get a theological education? Okay, these are all questions that come about kind of through the process of trying to get ordination, before trying to get ordination. All right, so these are all things that are kind of floating around. All right, so let's look at some early examples and then move into the 20th century because that's when we see the really, really big push. Okay. So the long first cited woman to be ordained is Antoinette Brown. Okay, this you'll read it in lots of different history books. This is pretty well known. Antoinette Brown was the first woman ordained in the United States. She was born in 1825 in New England. Her family had Puritan roots. She grew up in the Burned Over district, if you remember that, kind of the Second Great Awakening. It's called that because there's so many religious revivals there, okay? So she grew up sort of in the midst of religious revival. From a young age, she wanted to be a minister. Not a women's missionary, not a teacher, but a minister, and this had not happened yet, okay? The odds really seemed stacked against her. She applied to Oberlin, which was a liberal co-ed college, but it proved not liberal enough. They rejected her. She and her friend Lucy Stone kind of protested this, and they came to an agreement that she could take their theology classes, but she wouldn't get a degree or a license to preach. All right, I know what you're thinking, like, that's a terrible agreement on her part. But, at the time, it was the only way that she could get the theological education. And so that's what she did. All right. She took all the classes. She got a theological degree, but she got no credit for it. And she didn't get a license to preach afterwards. Okay. So over the next couple of years after Oberlin, she's occasionally preaching. Sometimes she'll be a guest visitor, usually at a very liberal pastor's church. He'll invite her and she could preach some. But in 1852, she's invited to become the pastor of a small Congregationalist church in South Butler, New York. Okay, she is appointed by the congregation itself. All right, so the congregation did not actually have the consent of the denomination, but due to the nature of the Congregationalist churches, the church themselves had a lot of power and over who they did or did not call, and so they had the authority to do that. Okay. Unfortunately, this wasn't the moment of triumph that she wanted, or really that historians would like it to be either. It didn't work out well. Okay. She didn't have support of other clergy because she was a woman. She didn't have a lot of support of her friends because they were more progressive and they were very, very suspect of religion. So she struggled immensely. Okay. And she ends up quitting. She steps down in 1854, just 2 years after she's called to this congregation. Okay. And eventually she left the Congregationalist altogether and she became a Unitarian, but she was unable to find a full-time ministry position within that denomination either. Okay. And to kind of compound this dubious success of this first, by the year 1900, so 50 years later, after her appointment, there were fewer than 40 ministers ever called in the Congregationalist denomination. Okay, so it was a first, but it did not really signify much real change. Okay, the first And the second woman who was ordained was Olympia Brown, no relation to Antoinette Brown. And she was the first person called with the consent of her denomination. Okay. And she actually did have a much more successful ministry degree. She also had difficulties getting a theological education, but eventually she did get into a program. And she ended up being a pastor for 25 years. Okay. In addition to her ministry work, she became a very successful leader in the women's rights movement. And due to her very, very long life, she lived to be, 91, I think. She actually saw the 19th Amendment pass. Okay. So kind of in the 19th century, we're not seeing much. Frances Willard, who just pops up all over the place in the 19th century, wrote a book in 1889 where she lists the denominations that ordain women. And in it, she lists Quakers, which is kind of misleading because they don't have ordained clergy at all. But women have always been, leaders within that denomination. The Methodists, Baptists, Free Baptists, Congregationalists, Universalists, and the Unitarians, because they were not merged yet, okay? And then she doesn't mention it, but there's also officers in the Salvation Army, okay? So, there is limited ordination. Ordination does not mean equality within a denomination by any means, though. Women tended to be paid less, have fewer desirable appointments, and have less say in the church hierarchy, okay? So they did not usher in this kind of new era for women's ordination, but it was a start, okay? So just to give you kind of an idea of like how slow this change was happening. The Congregationalists, who were the first to ordain Antoinette Brown, had only ordained 100 women over the course of 75 years, the first 75 years. So like by 1925. By 1959, the Unitarian Universalists had only one active female minister at that point in time. So some of these congregations that seemed like they'd be leaders just really didn't follow through with this. The 1930s was a terrible time for women's ordination. Okay. The very early ordinations really had to do with arguments like equality. But when the Great Depression hit and there were not enough jobs to go around, there was just an overall feeling in general like women shouldn't be taking the jobs. And that was doubly so for clergy. So you see actually a significant backsliding of women's ordinations with the Great Depression. Okay. So the feminist movement, though, in the 1960s and the 1970s, radically changes opportunities for women seeking ordination. Even if those changes took a little longer than women would have liked. Okay. For example, in 1965, over 70 Protestant denominations ordained women in the U.S. alone. Okay. These years also saw an incredible increase in women's enrollment in seminaries. From 1972 to 1980, for example, women enrolled in American seminaries increased 223% as opposed to just 31% for men. Increased enrollment was not even between traditions. For example, between 1970 and 1980, American Baptist seminaries saw a 9% increase in men enrolling and a 597% increase in enrollment for women. Okay. For predominantly black seminaries in the U.S., there was a 317% increase in women's enrollment. Okay. And then in turn, seminary faculties were changing as well. Okay, there is getting to be an increase in women professors. All right, the transition is difficult. Women face discrimination. Changes did not happen easily or quickly, but nonetheless, there was progress. Even when I was in seminary, I went to a Baptist seminary. It was like there was meetings for the wives, for the seminary students' wives, and those of us who are women were like, what's going on? So, I mean, these changes are very slow. Okay. So I want to highlight a few different stories about ordination. First is the ordination and the LCA and the ALC, which merged, of course, to create the ELCA, as you all know. So on Moodle, I have a storyboard. I didn't make it. Dan Lagerquist made it. And it's really, really cool, though. Okay, so both the LCA and the ALC voted to ordain women in 1970. And then, of course, in 1988, they merged. So this past year, 2 years ago, I think it was it was 2020, was the 50th anniversary of women's ordination in the ELCA, though this is not completely accurate since the ELCA didn't exist then, but anyway, you get the point. So especially if you're Lutheran, I encourage you to look through the storyboard. There's kind of a nice timeline, but there's a lot of fun pictures where you can see some of the first kind of women ordained and things. So take a look at that. It's pretty expansive, so you don't have to go through everything, but take a look around. It'll give you some good background in Lutheran ordination of women. All right, and then kind of a couple other interesting ones is the Episcopalians. I talked a little bit about Florence Timley Oy earlier, but then, she had to relinquish her ordination. So what actually happened when the Episcopalians and the Anglicans started ordaining women? So one thing about the Anglican Church, the Episcopalians are Anglicans. They just are called Episcopalians in the U.S. If you didn't know that, I'm sure most of you did. But they have a pretty structured hierarchy. Okay. Generally speaking, and this is just generalization, it's not across the board, but often the more structured hierarchy you have, the longer it takes to make changes. Okay. So it took a while for the Episcopalians to start ordaining women. They were particularly concerned with ecumenical considerations, which actually Lutherans were too, but Lutherans were more concerned with the Lutheran global community, whereas Episcopalians were actually very concerned about their relationship with the Catholic Church if they were going to ordain women. Okay. Remember, the Anglican communion is more high church than a lot of the other Protestant denominations, and they've kept a decent relationship with Catholic churches over the years. Okay. So this kind of makes sense. So I have a picture up, and this is the Philadelphia 11, okay, which happened in the United States. So 3 retired bishops ordained 11 women as priests, thus the Philadelphia 11, in 1974, okay. Now, there's a lot of debate about this, okay. So the Episcopalian Church is no, we cannot ordain women, and these bishops do it anyway. So obviously, their ordination was irregular, but was their ordination valid? Okay, that was a genuine, question. They had ordained bishops ordaining these women in the customary manner. Remember, apostolic succession is very, very important to the Anglicans, and that's how they did it. All right, so that happens. Obviously, there's debate around it, but just 2 years later, the denomination actually voted to allow women to become priests in general. Okay, so it was kind of a moot point anyway. Women were priests now. Okay, yes, some people left the denomination. That is to be expected whenever there's some sort of major change like that. Okay, but starting in 1976, the Episcopalians ordained women. Okay, now globally, a lot of churches in the Anglican communion ordain women, but not all of them, because each kind of Anglican church is autonomous within just this larger communion. Okay. So anyway, that's where I'm going to leave it for now. I've talked about Lutherans, Episcopalians. There's a lot more, but as I said, it's so broken down into denomination. Okay. So if I did not talk about your denomination, and you would like to know, you can shoot me an email, because I have resources on most denominations that I at least know some books or different things. So let me know if you I really, really want to know about, say, the Baptists or something. Okay. So just let me know. All right. And then the last thing I'd like to discuss is women in the academy. Okay. On the screen, I have a picture of Luther, Bachman Hall in particular. It's where my office is. Let's talk a little bit about theology and these different types of feminist theologies that emerge, okay? Now, with seminaries and doctoral programs increasingly being open to women, there are going to be theological developments, and of course, we see this. You read the chapter by Rosemary Radford Ruther, who's tracing the development of feminist theologies, and then you also read an article about from the womanist theologian Jacqueline Grant, and she's talking about kind of the establishment of womanist theology in the article. She was a pioneer in that, okay? So feminist theology, womanist, mujerista theologies, they all take a little bit of time to develop because it takes so long for women to actually get the theology degrees and to get onto the faculties and do this work, okay? But once it happens, it's really been an influential field of theology, okay? I've got some pictures on the screen. The first woman theologian to be on a seminary faculty in the U.S. Was Georgia Harkness. She's in the upper left-hand corner. I also have on the screen Katie Cannon, Rosemary Radford Ruther, Jacqueline Grant, Mary Daly. Those are just a few of the really influential early theologians. Okay. Now, I do just have to a quick. I don't want to spend too much time on this really, but the kind of conservative response to all this, all right? Now, I think it's important to name that these advancements that women have had in ministry, in the academy, this is not even. This is not across the board, okay? Women's opportunities have not been even, okay? And there's been significant reaction to women's advancements, particularly in certain areas, especially like, certain parts of the evangelical church, this little picture up here, the Council of Biblical Manhood and Womanhood is an evangelical Christian organization promoting complementarian views of gender issues. This was established in 1987. So this is coming on the heels of the feminist movement and all these changes. And then you kind of get this conservative reaction coming against it, okay? Central figures in this movement are like John Piper, Wayne Grudem, and many more, okay? In fact, really, as you see, as women are gaining more rights in mainline denominations, there's actually a restriction of a lot of women's rights in more like evangelical fundamentalist and some charismatic groups, okay? Because if you remember, in the 19th century, some of those groups actually had some of the most visible and vocal women in ministry, okay? So there's a real shift here, okay? And that's all I'm going to spend on that right now. I just want to point it out. All right, I'm going to wrap up this video. I will post one final goodbye finale at the end here. But I have gone on long enough here. So, all right, thanks everybody. Have a great week. Bye.